Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Kant on what I've called just what is right, or we could also say Kant on the principle of morality. Immanuel Kant, we've dipped our toes into Kant's thinking a little bit before when we read the short piece, What is Enlightenment? And for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be examining some key passages, ideas from Kant's moral philosophy. So to say that we're reading Kant's moral philosophy is to say that we're reading Kant's analysis of what he thinks is the right thing to do, right? Morality is about the basic characterization, such as right and wrong behavior. And Kant thinks that there are principles of right behavior. There are ways to behave in such a way that you are, in accordance with morality. And there are also ways of behaving where you're obviously discordant from the rules of morality, right? And Kant would point to obvious examples of like killing someone, exploitation, murder, lying, right? All of these practices, Kant would want to say, are inconsistent with what we think of as being the dignity of other human beings. And so Kant thinks that he can get out of this idea of human dignity a moral framework to evaluate basically what is it that we're obligated to do, right? What are the things that I absolutely cannot do under any circumstances? And what's the range of actions that are merely permitted? Kant thinks that he can give a really principled answer to these sorts of really tricky and difficult questions. And so the main purpose of our video today is going to be just to clarify the basic form of his answers to these questions so that we can use them perhaps in our own moral reflection, even if we think that they're wrong to some extent. I will say, if you've tried to do the reading like before you watch the video, Kant can be quite challenging. It's material that's a couple hundred years old, which is old news to you in this class, right? But he has kind of a dry, stodgy style. It's kind of like part of his thing. And that can really put people off of, what he's saying. And fair enough, right? But at least from my perspective, I think that Kant's moral theory is often a lot richer than people are liable to really give it credit. So I'm going to try to draw out as sympathetic an account as I can possibly manage, and then I will hear from all of you as to whether or not you find any of this stuff convincing in any way whatsoever. So for this first week, we're reading section 1 of this book called The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, right? That's a very intimidating title. But by metaphysics of morals, Kant just means like moral principles, right? And so he's trying to find the groundwork, the foundation, right, of morality, of moral principles, of the division into things that we call right and that we call wrong. Kant thinks that when we make these judgments, in most cases, we are correct. In other words, even if we are not philosophers and even if we have not read Kant's moral theory, Kant thinks that his moral theory roughly coheres with what he calls common sense. Right? And so Kant thinks that the outcomes of his moral theory generally reflect the moral beliefs that we already have before we even come to philosophy. And that's what he's mainly trying to demonstrate in this first section, as well as to at least begin to give a more substantive characterization to his philosophical view in general. So to begin with, let's consider the segment of the board that is roughly this, first quadrant or whatever, right? Not exactly a division into 4, but okay. Kant opens his arguments in the groundwork by saying that what we're after when we're looking for the supreme principle of morality, or we're looking for the groundwork or the foundation, right, is we're looking for a principle that can decide what to do when we have certain kinds of conflicts, right? So, just to give a couple of examples of moral dilemmas that might come up in your life, right? Um, you might think about, for example, if you were, in the French Resistance during the occupation during World War II, right? You, on the one hand, might have an obligation to, to resist, to play a very active role in your rebellion against the Nazi government, right? But you also might have this competing, obligation towards your family, right? To your loved ones, and maybe even to your own happiness in your own life, right? Because of the very real possibility that you will die. And so, what the supreme principle of morality is meant to clarify is that when you run into situations like this, what should you do, right? What moral value is of more worth than the other moral values, right? What do we take to be, really the core of right and wrong versus just like the extra cherry on top, right? And so Kant wants to argue that there are some things when we judge things morally that we consider to have conditional value, and then there's a whole another category that we consider to be of unconditional value. And so to say something is conditionally valuable is to say that it's good, we judge it morally to be good, under certain circumstances, right? So not all the time. Maybe we do in general. Maybe generally we like this stuff. We think it's valuable. We think it's important in some kind of way, right? But its value is, in an important sense, conditioned on something higher, something more important that has to be satisfied first, right? And this category of being conditionally valuable is where Kant puts most of the things that most people think about when they are judging right and wrong, right? So you might think about the sum total of happiness, right? You might think about virtue, right? The characteristics, right? Courage, bravery, kindness, and so on, right? You might think about talent or luck or success. These are all kind of related concepts, right? You might think about some good thing, right? These all seem like good things. These are all things that we want. These are all things that, we would like to have in our lives, and we consider them moral goods in some sense, right? And by moral good, I mean that your life is better with them, right, than without them. And, perhaps at least to some extent, this generates obligations on the part of yourself or other people to gain happiness and virtue and talent and, success and so on, right? You can't really gain luck. But Kant's argument is that these are valuable only when you might say they are accompanied by a good will, which for our purposes, at least initially, we can just characterize as a good intention, right? So, in other words, someone has to try to be good, right? In order for us to think about these things as actually good, right? So think about happiness, for example. Think about someone that we immediately consider morally repugnant, right? Adolf Hitler, for example, right? Adolf Hitler is morally repugnant, right? He does not have a good will. And so I'm actually not, I don't view it as very important or good if he were happy, right? I don't wish for Adolf Hitler's happiness, right? Why not? Because Adolf Hitler is not worthy of happiness, right? It seems inappropriate to us for people who commit grievous moral wrongs to, enjoy the spoils of exploiting or killing or whatever other people, So similarly, right? While we generally think that virtues like courageousness and kindness and attentiveness and all of these sort of things are good, right? In the case of morally evil persons, they're actually quite bad, right? Like it's not good that Adolf Hitler was a charismatic speaker, right? Why? Well, because that was not accompanied by this more important thing that is genuinely good intentions. So you can see too with talent and luck and success, right? These are all things that we think of as being valuable, but that we want to go to people that have good intentions, that want to do good, that want to make the world a better place because they're in it, right? They want to leave the world better than when they came into it. And when people that are more interested in themselves and their own sensual enjoyment and whatever, right, fulfilling their own sick fantasies, we don't consider these things to be morally good, right? In fact, we might think it's morally bad. And so Kant thinks that this is where, most people are in terms of their moral intuitions, right? Their views about what's right and what's wrong. The only thing that's right in every circumstance, that's good in every case, is trying to do good, right? We can know in every circumstance, whenever any kind of person is trying to be good, right? They have a genuine intention towards they will the good, right? Then the world, can play out however it wants, right? Sometimes the good guy loses. And yet, nevertheless, we still think about them as the good guy, right? We view ourselves as, in some ways, similar to them. It's so Kant thinks that this also accords with like our judgments of people, right? So like maybe it's the case that like someone that I think of as supremely immoral, right, an Adolf Hitler like character, perhaps has more talent or luck or success or maybe even some virtues and happiness than I have, right? That's entirely possible. But I view my life as morally better, morally superior to these people, right? And I would say the same about any other person. Why? Because I esteem morality higher than I esteem happiness, talent, luck, success, virtue, and so on. And so this is a form of deontology, which is a kind of moral theory that analyzes intentions rather than consequences or virtues or anything else like that. And so let's move over to this little segment of the board. Kant's ethics, therefore, is characterized by the claim that a good will is the supreme principle of morality, right? It's the only thing that is unconditionally valuable on this list. It's the thing that we think of as like the necessary check to whether these other things are valuable. And it is, in an important way, the source of morality's authority on Kant's view, right? Kant thinks, the answer why be moral is because for Kant, being moral is just recognizing your own dignity, right? Recognizing what it means to be a person. And so the aim of morality is not to teach us how to be happy, but how to be worthy of happiness on Kant's view, right? This is very different from Epicurus, right? Epicurus thought pleasure was the supreme good. It's the only important thing in the world, and it's intrinsically good, and we value it in all circumstances. Kant, to the contrary, is saying no, we only value it in certain specific kinds of circumstances. Morality is not about happiness or success or anything like that. Morality is about human dignity. Morality is about respecting other people as people. That is sort of like the core belief, the core insight of Kant's moral theory, is that it's based on our status not as like, maybe like animals or brains, right, that can feel happiness or good sensation or something like that, right? But it comes from the fact that we reason, right? It's not only the case that we simply take it for granted what to do. No, we ask for reasons for why people do things and we evaluate them, right? We say, oh, it's not a very good excuse. Okay, maybe that is a good excuse, that works, right? And we're constantly in this process of, exchanging and then evaluating each other's points of view and behavior, and we can ask the question why, right? This is why morality is closely tied with enlightenment and human dignity, is because when we're asking moral questions, we're simply asking why it is that we view certain things as, right or wrong or permitted or forbidden and so on. But you might think that up to this point we've left this idea of a good will pretty vague, and that is true. It is vague up to this point. Kant is trying to, at least initially, kind of get you on the line, right? Get you interested in the view that he's trying to present. And then he's going to give you a more substantive characterization of that view. And Kant thinks that the content of the supreme principle of morality, you can actually give at least 3 different formulations of it. And the reading for this first week contained the first formulation, which is often considered the most important one. Right? Here Kant says the following, quote, I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should become universal law. Now that is a difficult idea to break down, right? But let's try to figure it out together, right? A good starting point is thinking about the golden rule, right? Treat others how you would like to be treated. My family, for example, when I was growing up, this was emphasized as like, kind of the basis of morality. It's, it's a good source for thinking about, how you should treat people, what's right and what's wrong, and why, right? The golden rule helps children develop empathy and think about how their actions affect other people. And Kant, very similarly, is trying to draw our attention to something quite similar, right? Kant is trying to point out that many of our examples of immorality come from the viewpoint where we take ourselves to be exceptions. So, for example, Kant thinks, okay, maybe my rich friend offers me a loan and we come to an agreement about certain terms, right? But then I decide, screw this guy, he's rich, I shouldn't have to pay him back at all, right? I have no intention of ever, paying back the loan. I have no intention of fulfilling our agreement. I'm just sort of like, okay, I'm lying. I'm trying to get this money, whatever, right? Obviously, that would be a violation of the golden rule because I don't want to be treated that way. And it would also be a violation of the first formulation of what Kant calls the categorical imperative. That's just his word for morality. We'll talk more about the specific terminology of that categorical imperative in the next video, right? But the important thing to point out for now is simply just that what Kant is trying to think about is, well, in this case, I could not will that my maxim become universal law, right? What does that mean? Well, if everybody was looking to screw over their, their creditors, right? Then there wouldn't be the system of credit and loaning and finance and so on in the first place, right? if my will, right, the maxim of my will became the universal law, right, then my action wouldn't even be possible. There would be no loans to be had if everyone behaved that way, right? And so the golden rule and the categorical imperative are both trying to draw our attention to the fact that, well, when I think, oh, I'm going to screw over my creditor or friend because he's rich, right, I'm in a way kind of like making a mockery of the whole enterprise of you know, giving and asking for reasons, for making promises, for loaning money, right? And I can recognize any immoral action because it will always involve this kind of instance of making an exception for oneself, right? Why is murder wrong? Well, because, you don't want to be treated that way, right? And if everyone was always murdering each other, right, there's no possibility for human society or human social, forms at all. Importantly, Kant's point here is not to say that, like, everybody is going to act that way, right? Like, if you act immorally, right? Obviously, there are people that commit fraud now, right? And yet, we still have a financial system. There are still creditors and debtors all over, even though, people regularly commit fraud. Does that disprove Kant's moral theory? No, right? Why does it not? Because his point is hypothetical, right? In other words, it's not the reason why your action is wrong is not because it leads to some consequence, right? And that consequence is nobody follows the law or something like that. It doesn't lead to those consequences. The reason why your action is wrong is because your action is inconsistent with treating other people like persons, right? When I, say, screw my friend, whatever, he's rich, in that case, like, I'm not treating my friend as a person, right? I'm not treating him as someone who has dignity, someone who makes decisions, someone who can make a claim about my behavior and suggest that I'm not acting right, right? And in a way, Kant is trying to point out that that is self-undermining, right? Immorality, Kant thinks, is actually just inconsistent with what it means to be free, right? And what it means to be free, on Kant's view, is exactly this process of giving and asking for reasons with one another, right? Freedom is not me being able to be like, screw you, I'm going to take all of your money or whatever, right? And there's this kind of, ego driven warfare of everybody against everybody, right? Instead, freedom is about us being able to ask each other questions and have conversations and understand each other and decide to act in concert with one another. Decide that, we think that each other's morals and goals and behaviors and their role in life is good, and we want it to make that a part of our own lives, right? And so instances of immorality are ways that we, importantly, make ourselves less free, right? Because we are, in a way, undermining the whole system of, giving and asking for reasons. Now, it should be clear that the reason why, for example, like, some people want to object to Kant and be like, well, if what Kant says is right, then when I go out every day and I'm acting as Penelope, right, then I now have the expectation that everyone's going to go out and everyone's going to act as Penelope or something like that, right? But importantly, it's not my action that becomes universal law, right? It's not being Penelope that becomes universal law. It is the maxim, right, underlying the action, right? I also wrote maxim over here to emphasize it as a key vocabulary term. And a maxim is like a principle, right? So when I'm choosing to go out and to be Penelope and doing my everyday stuff, drinking dirty chai, reading philosophy, whatever, right? I'm not saying everyone needs to go out and read philosophy, be Penelope, and drink dirty chais and so on. But the principle underlying this behavior, right? I want to be myself. And I want everyone else to be able to be themselves. And I think philosophy is good. And, all of this kind of stuff. The principles, the reasons why, the reasons I would cite if somebody asked me why I committed the action that I did, that is perfectly consistent with everybody else being everybody else, right? When I choose to drink a dirty chai, right, the principle behind that behavior is not like dirty chai is good or something like that, but something more abstract, like, well, I should be able to satisfy my own sensory desires, right, and so should other people. And so this principle is perfectly consistent with the idea that everyone's going to live their own lives and we can all be different. And Kant is not at all insisting that we all have to be the same. Kant is instead trying to draw our attention to ways that immoral actions involve making an exception of oneself. And this is largely true of people that study genocides and massive human tragedies, right? Oftentimes, like Nazi diplomats, for example, they just thought of Jews as an exception. They thought of them as, a literal subhuman species, right? And this was the racism of the Nazi regime, is that they viewed this group of people as subhuman. And therefore, they could make an exception to the moral rules, like you should treat other people with dignity, by trying to insist that these other people are in fact not people, right? The next idea is I want to clarify the distinction of conformity with duty versus acting from duty. Now, Kant's going to say that real moral worth comes from acting from duty, and that when you're acting in conformity with duty, that this is basically like an accident, right? And it's actually not morally valuable. The example that Kant gives is a greedy shopkeeper, right? And so in this case, a greedy shopkeeper has a young child, maybe 6 years old or something like that, stumble into his store, and the child attempts to overpay for an item, right? What should the shopkeeper do? Well, so envision the scenario in which the shopkeeper doesn't rip off the kid, right? But the shopkeeper refuses to rip off the kid because he knows, oh, well, if word gets out about this, it's going to be so bad for me, right? In this case, we don't think about the shopkeeper's intentions as morally good, even though the shopkeeper is in an important sense, in conformity with his duty, right? He didn't rip off the kid, right? So most moral theories would say, well, we should celebrate that guy for not ripping off the child, right? But Kant says, no, in this case, we have mere conformity with duty, and he's not acting from duty. In other words, if the circumstances were different, and he could know somehow that like nobody else would find out about, him ripping off the kid, then he would rip off the kid, right? And that's not truly moral. That's not moral intention behind his behavior. He acted in conformity with his duty. He didn't rip off the kid, but it was almost an accident, right? It was because the circumstances were such that it was like more practical to act morally in that case. Kant also, in a kind of hilarious way, gives an example of a nice neighbor, right? And Kant also says that your nice neighbor, Ned Flanders type from The Simpsons, if that might be too old of a reference at this point, but in any case, like Ned Flanders, is a nice neighbor character in The Simpsons cartoon. Kant would say he's also not morally valuable. Why? Because he's nice just because he enjoys it, right? He doesn't see, in an important sense, that moral action requires that we're motivated by morality, right? When we're truly acting morally, we're doing so because it's the right thing to do, not because it makes me feel good, not because the circumstances lined up in such a way that everything works out for me, or anything like that. We're going to continue to give a more robust and substantive characterization of Kant's moral philosophy in the next video, part 2, on the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you all think. Bye bye.